Story number 1. Weather forecasting in West Virginia's mountains can be unreliable, but nothing could have prepared me for the night a derecho swept through my campsite. For an experienced camper, most weather events are manageable with proper preparation. A derecho, however, is nature's equivalent of a war zone, a fast-moving wall of destructive wind that can level forests and demolish buildings in minutes. I'd found what seemed like a reasonable compromise for shelter that night. A single-walled pavilion with a solid cement floor. The structure offered protection from flying debris and falling trees, which were already beginning to crash down around the area as the storm intensified. Setting up my tent inside the pavilion felt like a smart decision at the time, until I realized I wasn't the only one seeking refuge from the storm. The first indication of my unwanted companion came during a brief lull in the wind. A massive black bear, clearly agitated by the storm, had also decided the pavilion was the safest place to be. In my years of camping, I'd encountered numerous black bears outside my tent. Usually they're timid creatures that quickly retreat when confronted with human noise. This situation was drastically different. The bear's behavior was unlike anything I'd previously encountered. Rather than maintaining a cautious distance, it began circling my tent in an agitated state. The sound of its claws against the cement floor created a rhythmic tap, tap, tap that punctuated each galloping stride. This persistent clicking became a terrifying metronome, marking each circuit the bear made around my temporary shelter. The noise grew closer with each pass, suggesting the bear was tightening its circles around my tent. The combination of sensory inputs was overwhelming. The derecho's gale-force winds provided a devastating background symphony, punctuated by the cracking and crashing of trees being ripped from the ground. Against this chaos, the bear's huffing and puffing grew increasingly aggressive, its breathing pattern suggesting a mix of fear and anger. The huffs became deeper, more guttural, a clear sign of escalating stress. Each time it left the pavilion, I'd feel a moment of hope, only to have it instantly crushed as the animal returned, somehow more agitated than before. My usual tactics for deterring black bears proved completely ineffective. I started with firm shouts, then escalated to more aggressive vocalizations, the kind that had always sent bears running in previous encounters. When that failed, I switched to sharp, loud commands, and even resorted to cursing and threatening language, techniques that typically trigger a black bear's instinct to avoid human confrontation. But the storm had worked this bear into such a state that normal bear behavior no longer applied. It was trapped between its fear of the storm and its uncertainty about my presence, creating a dangerous combination of conflicting instincts. As the hours dragged on, I made what preparations I could for a worst-case scenario. I used duct tape to secure my hunting knife to my hand, knowing that if the bear decided to enter my tent, I'd have precious little time to react. The sound of those claws on cement continued to mark the passage of time. Tap, 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 mixing with the storm's fury in a uniquely terrifying cocktail of natural threats. The bear's movements became more erratic. Sometimes it would stop suddenly, and I could hear its heavy breathing just feet from my tent wall before resuming its frantic circling. The reality of my situation was stark. I was trapped in a small tent inside a pavilion during one of the most destructive weather events possible, sharing my shelter with a panic-stricken bear that could easily tear through my tent walls. Every survival instinct I'd developed through years of outdoor experience told me to leave, but the derecho made that impossible. Through the tent walls, I could see the strobe-like effect of trees falling and debris flying in the storm's fury. The bear's shadows cast by intermittent lightning made its massive size all too apparent. The only option was to wait it out, hoping the bear's fear of the storm would continue to outweigh its aggression toward me. Each time the wind intensified, the bear's agitation would spike, leading to faster circuits around my tent and more aggressive vocalizations. The pavilion's roof groaned under the wind's assault, and I found myself praying it would hold. If it failed, both the bear and I would lose our shelter from the chaos outside. It served as a humbling lesson that sometimes, despite experience and preparation, your only option is to remain still, stay quiet, and hope the forces of nature choose to spare you. Story number 2. Spring break camping in March seemed like a perfect getaway for two college students in a new relationship. The state park was operating at low capacity due to the cold weather, with only a handful of other campers scattered across the grounds. The closest group to our site was barely visible across the lake, but that solitude felt more peaceful than concerning. Our inexperience with camping became apparent after setting up our tent. We'd forgotten several essential items. The park's general store near the entrance was our only option for supplies. What should have been a quick errand became the first warning sign of the night's events to come. A white pickup truck occupied the parking space in front of the store. 5 or 6 men gathered around it loading ice into coolers. As we approached the entrance, they fell silent, then erupted in wolf whistles. One of them made a show of nudging the others, pointing and grinning. The harassment escalated inside the store as they followed us in, spreading out through the aisles. Their comments grew increasingly vulgar and explicit, their voices deliberately loud. "Look what we got here, boys," one called out, while another detailed exactly what he'd like to do with that. My husband moved closer to me as we grabbed our supplies, both of us painfully aware of how they'd positioned themselves between us and the exit. Back at our campsite, we tried to salvage the evening. The fire provided warmth against the March chill, and we managed to prepare dinner and enjoy some time together. As night fell, we retired to our tent, hoping to put the uncomfortable encounter behind us. Neither of us wanted to voice our lingering unease about the men from the store. The distinctive rumble of a large truck shattered that hope. Tires crunched slowly on gravel as a vehicle pulled into the adjacent campsite, despite the entire park being nearly empty, with countless available spots spread across the grounds. The engine idled for a long moment before cutting off. Car doors slammed, followed by the sound of coolers being dragged across truck beds and men's voices carrying across the short distance between sites. The darkness prevented us from confirming if it was the same group, but the timing and choice of location felt deliberate. We lay in tense silence, listening to them set up camp, catching fragments of conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed to carry threatening undertones. Sleep came uneasily, interrupted by the growing sounds of drunken activity from the neighboring site. Around 3 a.m., flashlight beams suddenly cut through our tent walls. The beams moved with deliberate slowness, sweeping across our tent as if studying its contents. Multiple voices murmured just outside, their drunken tones carrying clear threats. "I saw her at the store," one voice slurred, followed by crude laughter. "Wonder if they're awake in there," another asked. We lay completely still, hardly daring to breathe as the lights continued their invasive inspection. The beams crossed repeatedly over where we lay, accompanied by the sound of footsteps circling our tent. When the flashlights finally moved away, we didn't waste time discussing options. In the darkness, we began shoving our gear into the car as quietly as possible. Every rustle of movement felt thunderously loud in the quiet park. A tent stake caught and jingled against another piece of equipment. The sound froze us in place. The neighboring campsite's fire still burned bright enough to illuminate the white pickup truck parked there, the same one from the store. Through the trees, we could see their flashlight beams swinging wildly as they moved through their sight. Their drunken voices growing louder again. Hands trembling, we loaded the last of our belongings into the car. The sounds of movement from their sight seemed to be growing closer. We didn't wait to find out why. We pulled away as quietly as possible, not turning on our headlights until we'd put some distance between us and their sight. Only then did I release the breath I'd been holding, watching the rearview mirror until the park entrance disappeared behind us. Years later, we both got concealed carry permits. Remote camping spots in meth country demand pragmatic safety measures. Story number 3. Growing up in Wyoming, our family paradoxically did most of our camping in Colorado. Our trips always followed a familiar pattern. Dad expertly navigating mountain roads in our 1976 Ford Country Squire, Mom ensuring we had enough supplies, my little brother enthusiastically pointing out every animal he spotted, and me, notorious for getting lost even in familiar places, taking in the mountain scenery. This particular campsite was typical of our usual spots. High enough in the mountains that the afternoon thunderstorms were a daily event, but not so remote that Dad worried about the country squire's aging transmission. We'd set up our tent on a small flat space between towering pines, their branches creating a natural canopy that would later prove both blessing and curse. The evening had followed our normal routine. Dad struggling with the Coleman stove, while Mom pretended not to notice his creative cursing, my brother meticulously organizing his scout gear, and me trying to find the perfect spot to lay out my sleeping bag where tree roots wouldn't poke through the tent floor. The cold that woke me in the early hours was different from our usual mountain chill. It had a biting quality that seemed to seep through every layer of my sleeping bag, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I lay there for what felt like hours, curled into a tight ball, before deciding to make a break for the car's relative warmth. The tent's nylon floor crackled like static electricity as I tried to extract myself from my sleeping bag without disturbing anyone. Of course, my attempts at stealth failed spectacularly. Climbing over my brother, a necessary evil given our tent's layout, he stirred immediately. His eyes popped open with that particular alertness that younger siblings reserve for catching their older sisters in solo adventures. Like clockwork, he declared he needed to pee, his standard excuse whenever he wanted to tag along. It was such a transparent ploy that I almost laughed despite my chattering teeth. The sky was just beginning to lighten as we emerged from the tent, the air sharp enough to make breathing feel like swallowing ice. Seeing the first hints of dawn, I abandoned my car plan, figuring I might as well stay up and watch the sunrise. My brother, ever the shadow, immediately demanded to know about my change of plans, his breath forming little clouds in the cold air. I pointed to what I thought was early morning light painting the mountaintop in a strange reddish glow. That's when my little brother's Cub Scout training kicked in, complete with the badge-earned confidence that made him temporarily forget his role as annoying younger sibling. He insisted with unwavering certainty that the sun couldn't possibly rise in that direction. He even pulled out his compass to prove it, the little plastic device glowing faintly in the dim light. Being the older sibling, I naturally had to argue, despite my notorious lack of directional sense that had become a running family joke. Dad always said I could get lost going to my own room, but surely even I could recognize a sunrise. Our increasingly heated debate about basic astronomy eventually drew our father's attention. Dad's head emerged from the tent, his usual patient expression replaced with the particular frustration reserved for children arguing before dawn. But his reprimand died in his throat as he caught sight of the red glow we'd been arguing about. His face changed in a way I'd never seen before, and one word cut through the crisp mountain air: fire. What followed was a blur of urgent activity that would later become a lesson in priorities. We didn't even break down the tent properly, just yanked up the stakes and collapsed it with everything still inside. Sleeping bags, clothes, and my brother's carefully organized scout gear becoming a jumbled mess we shoved into the back of the country squire. The car's doors creaked in protest as we yanked them open, the cold metal burning against our hands. Dad's usual careful driving on mountain roads gave way to a speed that seemed terrifying on the narrow, winding gravel path. Each turn kicked up clouds of dust that mixed with the increasingly thick smoke, creating an eerie fog in our headlights. The lack of guardrails between us and the sheer drops made every turn feel like a gamble, the old station wagon's suspension groaning in protest at each correction. The smoke began thickening around us, turning the early morning light into an otherworldly haze. Dad kept reassuring us we were well ahead of the fire, but his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel told a different story. The forest on either side of the road seemed to press in closer, and every bend revealed more smoke ahead, each breath becoming sharper and more acrid. We'd only been driving for what felt like minutes when a game warden's truck emerged from a side road, lights flashing through the smoke like desperate signals. The brief conversation between him and Dad confirmed our fears. The fire was spreading faster than expected, consuming the dry pine forest with frightening speed, and he was racing to evacuate other campsites. Though he assured us we had enough time to get out safely, it didn't slow Dad's pace on those treacherous roads. The memory of that morning stays sharp even decades later. Each summer, when wildfire footage appears on the news from the West or Canada, that same cold fear flickers in the back of my mind. The memory of learning just how quickly a peaceful mountain morning can turn into a race against nature. Story number 4. Our camp on the family lot in Sequoia. National Forest felt different that August night. The darkness pressed in closer than usual since we were only using a small potbelly stove for heat. The pier fire had swept through 2 years prior, and none of us wanted to risk an open flame, especially being so far from cell service. Just 4 of us occupied the site that evening: my partner, another couple, and my 2 dogs, who were curled up under a sleeping bag at my feet. The elevation brought a characteristic mountain chill that made us grateful for the stove's modest warmth. The conversation flowed easily as we sat around the dim stove light, sharing stories and enjoying the mountain solitude. We hadn't seen another soul on Slate Mountain all day, which wasn't unusual for this remote spot. The night air carried that distinct pine scent that always reminded me of childhood camping trips, though something about it felt sharper, more alert. Between stories, I could hear the gentle whisper of wind through the surviving pines, their branches casting subtle shadows in the stove's glow. Around 10:30 p.m., my dog's behavior shifted. They didn't react like they had during our previous bear encounter, where their hackles raised and they vocalized their concerns. Instead, they simultaneously sat up from under their blanket, positioning themselves with their backs against my legs. Their posture was protective but controlled as they tested the air with lifted noses. The change was subtle enough that I might not have noticed if I hadn't spent countless nights watching their reactions to wildlife. Their muscles tensed beneath their fur, but they remained eerily silent. As if responding to some unseen cue, our conversation naturally died. In that moment of silence, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual nighttime sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, faded to nothing. Years of camping had taught me to read these small shifts in the woodland atmosphere, and something about this one raised the hair on my neck. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, though the stove still radiated steady heat. That's when we heard it. Footsteps. Not the 4-legged gait of a bear or the careful prowl of a mountain lion, but the distinct rhythm of bipedal movement. They came from the steep slope beside our tent deck, an area we'd specifically avoided during daylight hours due to the treacherous combination of fallen leaves and the sharp incline. Yet these steps moved uphill with impossible speed and confidence. The sound cut through the silence with unnatural clarity, each footfall precisely placed despite the treacherous terrain. I've spent enough time in these mountains to recognize animal movements. Bears lumber, deer bound, mountain lions slink. But this was different. The cadence was wrong for any local wildlife. Each step landed with purpose, maintaining a pace that shouldn't have been possible on that hazardous slope. The rhythm suggested something moving with deliberate intent, navigating the steep incline as if it were level ground. My camping experience told me to catalog the facts. The sound originated roughly 15 feet from our position, moved in a straight line uphill, and demonstrated no hesitation despite the challenging terrain. The footfalls carried a weight that suggested something substantial, yet they navigated the leaf-strewn incline with inexplicable ease. The sound tracked upward for about 20 seconds before fading into the darkness above our camp. Without discussion, our group collectively decided to break the strange atmosphere. Someone switched on the generator, its mechanical drone cutting through the tension. The familiar sounds seemed to reset the forest, and gradually, the normal nighttime chorus resumed. The dogs relaxed their stance, though they remained closer to me than usual. The temperature normalized, and the pine scent returned to its typical gentle presence. We never heard those footsteps again during our stay, but the following morning's inspection of the slope revealed no tracks or disturbances in the thick layer of leaves. That fact alone didn't surprise me. The ground was too dry and leaf-covered to hold prints. What stayed with me was the certainty shared by 4 experienced campers that we'd heard something moving in a way that defied the natural order of our mountain wilderness. The slope stood as steep and impassable as ever in the daylight, making the previous night's inexplicable ascent even more difficult to rationalize. Story number 5. I've been camping most of my life, mainly around the southeast. My buddy Mark and I try to get out to the mountains at least once a month, usually up in North Georgia, where there's some decent primitive sites if you know where to look. We're pretty comfortable with the area by now. I grew up in Atlanta, and while the mountain towns can be a bit insular, people are generally friendly enough if you're respectful. This one trip from last summer still bugs me though. We'd headed up for a weekend at one of the remote sites past Chatsworth, planning to do some hiking and maybe fish a little. It was a Friday afternoon in July, crazy humid like it always is, and we stopped at this small grocery store to grab supplies. We'd brought most of our gear but needed some ice and snacks. That's when we found out we were in a dry county. Neither of us had thought to check beforehand. When we were checking out, we asked the cashier if there was anywhere nearby we could buy beer. She told us about a bar just across the county line, giving us detailed directions. Past the old feed store, right at this big split oak tree, follow the creek bed till the road curves. 10 minutes tops, she said. The sun was starting to set as we followed her directions. The pavement got rougher, which isn't unusual for back roads out there. Cell service dropped, but that's normal in the mountains. What started feeling off was how precise her directions were. Every single landmark was exactly where she said it would be, which almost never happens with local directions. Usually there's at least one vague turn or missing detail. When we got to where this bar was supposed to be, something felt wrong. The building sat there like an old storage shed, every window bricked up, just a screen door under one light bulb. No cars, no signs, nothing to suggest it was actually a business. In these parts, even the most backwoods bar usually has a couple pickup trucks outside and at least a neon beer sign. We sat there idling for a minute, making nervous jokes about deliverance. You know, city boys out in the sticks. But the longer we looked at that building, the more wrong it felt. No sound coming from inside, no movement, just that single bulb and a whole lot of darkness. Mark and I didn't even need to discuss it. I turned the car around and we headed back to the campsite. Next morning, we were setting up our camp stove for coffee when we got talking with some local folks at nearby sites. Mentioned our failed beer run, and their reactions were concerning. This couple from the area said they'd never known of any bar out there. The guy seemed pretty certain. He'd grown up nearby, knew those roads well. His wife mentioned they'd heard similar stories from other campers who'd gotten the same directions. Later, another local, older guy who'd been coming to these sites for decades, told us that building used to be storage for logging equipment, but it had been abandoned for years. He knew exactly which building we meant, down to the split oak landmark. When we described where we'd been sent, he got real quiet for a minute, then said we were smart to trust our instincts and turn around. Look, I've spent enough time in remote areas to know that sometimes locals like to mess with tourists, and maybe that's all this was. Just someone having fun sending city folks on a wild goose chase. But something about that building and how everyone at the campsite knew exactly what we were talking about still sits wrong with me. These days when we camp up that way, we make damn sure to bring everything we need with us. Sometimes it's better to go without than to follow directions to places that don't feel right. Story number 6, I'd never been camping before when my girlfriend suggested we celebrate her birthday and our anniversary with a weekend in the woods. We picked a campground about 5 hours from home, packed what we thought we needed based on some rushed internet research, and headed out early the morning after a storm system had moved through the area. The weather had cleared, but humidity hung in the air, making everything feel heavy and damp. The ranger at the entrance booth looked surprised to see us. "You're the only ones here this weekend," he said, handing over our site assignment. We were excited at first. Having the whole place to ourselves seemed perfect for a romantic getaway. The enthusiasm lasted until we started driving deeper into the grounds, watching the main road narrow into a dirt path barely wide enough for our sedan. The path twisted between old growth trees, making it clear we'd need to reverse the entire way out when we left. After parking, we realized we had no idea how to properly set up our borrowed tent. The instructions were missing, and what looked simple in YouTube videos proved challenging in practice. The ground was too soft in some spots, too hard in others, and we spent 40 minutes just finding a level area that would hold our stakes. At least the weather was cool enough that our struggles didn't leave us completely drenched in sweat. Once we had something resembling a campsite, we decided to explore while daylight was on our side. The recent storm had left everything waterlogged, creating a distinct earthy smell that mixed with decomposing leaves. Our shoes quickly became caked with mud as we walked. The woods were strangely quiet. No woodpeckers, no squirrels, not even the usual buzz of insects. Just the occasional drip of water from saturated branches overhead. A few miles into our walk, we came across a cluster of white cabins. They were identical structures, lined up with architectural precision that looked out of place among the organic scatter of forest growth. Each cabin had the same dimensions, same paint job, same empty windows staring out at nothing. No vehicles parked outside, no equipment, no footprints in the mud. The uniformity made them feel more like a movie set than actual shelters. We didn't discuss it, just turned around and headed back toward our campsite. Our attempt at building a fire revealed just how unprepared we were. We'd brought self-lighting logs and lighter fluid from Walmart, but everything around us was soaked. The wet wood just hissed and smoked when we tried to light it. After an hour of increasingly frustrated attempts, we managed to create a sad little flame that barely heated our hot dogs and did nothing for the marshmallows except give them a faint, smoky taste. As the sun set, the temperature dropped noticeably. Our small fire cast weak shadows that made the surrounding forest seem to shift and move. My girlfriend's voice got quieter, tenser as she suggested we get in the tent. We extinguished what remained of our fire, the wet wood giving off a thick smoke that clung to our clothes. We were trying to have a normal conversation in the tent when she suddenly pressed her hand against my mouth. That's when I heard it. Footsteps on the wet ground. Heavy, deliberate steps that suggested multiple people walking with purpose. I whispered something about wildlife, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't right. The rhythm was too measured, too consistent for animals. Then came the mumbling, low voices carrying the cadence of speech without forming distinct words. The footsteps and murmuring grew closer until they seemed to circle our tent. We sat completely still in the darkness, barely breathing, as the sounds moved around us. Then everything went silent. After what felt like hours, my girlfriend whispered that we needed to get to the car. I looked out first, seeing nothing in the absolute darkness. We sprinted to the vehicle, and once inside, the reality of our situation became clear. We were supposedly alone in these woods, so what had we heard? I made one trip for the cooler, then returned for the tent. As I pulled the stakes from the ground, the footsteps started again, closer this time. I abandoned any pretense of proper packing, wrapping everything in the tarp and throwing it in the trunk before jumping behind the wheel. In our panic to leave, we hit a multi-way intersection I didn't remember. As we sat there, my headlights caught a partially hidden sign pointing toward the exit. As we followed it out, I noticed a single green light glowing in the woods near our abandoned site. The first artificial light we'd seen since sunset. We drove straight through to my girlfriend's parents' house, arriving around 4 a.m. We never talked about that trip afterward. Some experiences don't need discussion to leave their mark. I've found other ways to spend weekends since then, preferably ones with streetlights and cell service. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.